The scream of a bicycle tire skidding against hot asphalt split the quiet of the neighborhood afternoon, followed by a harsh, commanding voice that made people on the sidewalk turn their heads. "Get off that bike! Now!" The shout carried authority, but also something darker, suspicion dripping with contempt. The sound of footsteps running followed, the heavy boots of a police officer pounding against the ground, closing in on a young black woman who had done nothing but pedal down the block on her way home. Her chest rose and fell with quickened breaths as her knuckles whitened around the handlebars. The officer's hand was already reaching for the holster at his side, not for his gun, but for his pepper spray. His face was red, jaw clenched, his voice echoing through the street like a siren. "I said stop! That bike isn't yours!" She pulled the brakes, startled not just by his tone, but by the sheer force in his eyes, like he had already written the ending of this story before it even began. Her name was Danielle Carter, and in that frozen moment, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. Neighbors peeking out windows, people on porches, the hum of phones being raised to record. Her mouth was dry as she tried to form words, but the officer didn't give her space. He shoved her shoulder, pushing her against the frame of the bike, his voice rising louder. "Where did you get this? Whose bike did you steal?" The burn of humiliation stung sharper than the summer heat. Danielle wasn't just anybody. She wasn't some teenager with no defense. She was 32, a decorated civil rights attorney who had fought cases like this in the courtroom, exposing injustice, demanding accountability. Yet here she was, cornered in the middle of her own neighborhood, treated like a thief for daring to ride home on her own bike. Her eyes watered, not from pepper spray, not yet, but from the fury building in her chest, because she knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about the bike. It was about her skin. That was the moment she made a choice, not to shrink, not to cower. She let him rant, let him throw his accusations, the camera phones capturing every ugly word. Her hand trembled as she reached into her bag, slow enough not to startle him, deliberate enough to command attention. The officer's voice cracked with a warning. "Keep your hands where I can see them." But Danielle pulled out a small leather case and flipped it open with one motion, holding it in the air like a gavel brought down in a courtroom. The gold letters glistened under the sun. Her voice, clear and unshakable, cut through the noise. "Attorney Danielle Carter, and you just assaulted me on camera." For a beat, the world stood still. The officer's face drained of color as the reality dawned on him, the crowd buzzing like a wave crashing against stone. The woman he thought he could reduce to nothing was the very kind of power he feared. Educated, authoritative, untouchable by the lies he was about to spin. Danielle didn't lower her arm. She didn't flinch. She let the badge shine. Let it remind everyone watching that justice had a name, and it was hers. But this story wasn't just about one badge. It was about every person who had been humiliated without one. Danielle had grown up in this very neighborhood, where warnings from her mother echoed every time she stepped outside. Keep your hands visible. Don't talk back. Stay calm, even when they're wrong. She had carried those lessons all her life, into the courtroom, into her work, defending those who couldn't defend themselves. And yet, despite all her education, all her victories, all her credentials, she had ended up here, shoved, accused, degraded, simply because someone saw a black woman on a nice bike and thought criminal. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were shouting now. "She said she's an attorney! Leave her alone! We got this on video!" Phones pointed like weapons more powerful than any baton, amplifying her truth. The officer stumbled backward, his arrogance slipping, but Danielle stepped forward. For once, she wasn't in a courtroom fighting on someone else's behalf. This was her battle, her dignity, and she wasn't backing down. The officer muttered, his tone shaky. "Ma'am, I was just making sure—" But Danielle cut him off. Her voice was steel. "You weren't making sure. You were making assumptions. And you laid hands on me. That's assault, officer." Her words carried not just to him, but to every single ear in the crowd, to every recording phone that would soon upload this moment for millions to see. The tension cracked wide open. This wasn't just confrontation anymore. This was revelation. Because Danielle didn't just hold a badge proving who she was. She held receipts, proof, a life's work dedicated to dismantling exactly this kind of abuse. And as she stared into his wide, trembling eyes, she knew she had him cornered, not with force, not with fear, but with truth that could no longer be silenced. The career he thought was untouchable, it had just ended in broad daylight. And Danielle, standing tall, steady, unshaken, became more than just a victim of his racism. She became the reckoning. Danielle stood in the middle of the street, her chest rising and falling as her badge gleamed in the sunlight. But the confrontation wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. The officer, his name stitched across his uniform as O'Connor, was breathing hard, his face flushed with the embarrassment of being exposed in front of a growing crowd. His hand hovered awkwardly near his belt, not quite letting go of the pepper spray, but not daring to use it now. The authority he'd walked in with was slipping through his fingers like sand, and everyone could see it. The street had gone from ordinary to electric in minutes. Mothers clutching their children stood frozen on the sidewalks. Teens angled their phones for the best shot. Neighbors whispered to each other, their voices cutting through the hot air. And Danielle felt the weight of every one of those eyes pressing against her skin. She knew this wasn't just her moment. This was our moment. Her heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain calm, measured, the voice she used when cross-examining witnesses in court. "Officer O'Connor," she said evenly, "you accused me of theft. You shoved me, and you attempted to detain me without cause. Do you know what that's called?" She didn't give him time to answer. Her tone sharpened like a blade. "It's called unlawful assault. It's called racial profiling. And it's called abuse of power." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a rising tide of agreement. Someone shouted, "Yeah, tell him!" Another voice echoed, "We got everything on tape!" Danielle felt the momentum building, not just behind her, but around her. The officer glanced nervously at the phones pointed in his direction, his eyes darting like a trapped animal looking for escape. But Danielle wasn't finished. She tightened her grip on her badge and held it higher. "I've spent my career defending clients against exactly this. Black boys dragged off bikes. Black women accused of theft. Families torn apart because someone like you assumed guilt before they even asked a question." Her words thundered across the street, reaching not just O'Connor, but the invisible courtroom of public opinion that was forming in real time. O'Connor tried to recover his footing. His voice cracked, but he forced a defensive tone. "Ma'am, I received a call. A report of a stolen bike matching the description." Danielle cut him off again, her eyes blazing. "No, you didn't. That's the excuse you're going to try to use, isn't it? But let me remind you, everything you've done and everything you've said is recorded. Every witness here heard what you shouted. You didn't ask for proof. You didn't question politely. You went straight to violence. You went straight to me. The crowd erupted with claps and shouts of, "That's right!" O'Connor's voice was swallowed by the noise. For the first time, Danielle saw fear flicker behind his arrogance, a recognition that the power he carried in his uniform was shrinking under the glare of truth. But fear wasn't enough. Danielle had learned long ago that exposing injustice wasn't just about standing up. It was about pressing forward until the system had no choice but to acknowledge the wound. She pulled her phone from her bag, her hand steady now, her voice calm but deadly serious. "Here's what's going to happen, officer. I'm calling your precinct. I'm reporting this incident. And when I'm done, every single one of these videos is going online." O'Connor's composure cracked. "Wait, ma'am, let's not escalate this further." His voice carried desperation now, no longer the commanding bark of authority, but the plea of a man who could see his career unraveling strand by strand. But Danielle didn't blink. "You escalated it the moment you put your hands on me. You escalated it the moment you decided my skin color was enough evidence to call me a thief. I'm not escalating. I'm documenting." The words rolled through the crowd like thunder. Phones zoomed in. People leaned forward. And Danielle could feel the energy shifting, the balance of power tilting. This wasn't just about her bike anymore. It was about a community rising to witness justice in real time. And still, beneath the adrenaline, Danielle felt the tremor of something deeper. Memories. Her younger brother Marcus being stopped at 16 for walking suspiciously. Her mother crying quietly in the kitchen after telling Danielle's father, "One day, they'll come for her too." The long shadow of those warnings hung heavy now, as though all those years of fear and preparation had led to this moment. She steadied herself, drew a deep breath, and looked O'Connor in the eyes. "You thought you could humiliate me, but what you didn't know is that I am not powerless. I am not voiceless, and I will make sure you never do this to anyone else again." The words landed like a gavel striking wood, and the crowd roared. But Danielle knew this wasn't yet the end. No, the climax was still coming. Because men like O'Connor didn't surrender easily. And as she watched his jaw tighten, his hand twitch against his belt, she braced herself. The real test was about to begin. For a moment, the world held its breath. Danielle could feel the thrum of her pulse in her ears, a heavy drumbeat that matched the restless shifting of the crowd around her. Officer O'Connor stood rigid, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, humiliation, anger, and the primal instinct to claw back the power slipping through his hands. His lips twitched as though words were forming but dying before they left his tongue. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, he did the unthinkable. His hand dropped back to the pepper spray at his belt. Gasps shot through the crowd like sparks. Mothers yanked their children closer. Phones steadied in trembling hands. Danielle's body froze for half a second, not out of fear but out of pure disbelief. Even now, even with the cameras, even with the truth hanging over his head like a guillotine, O'Connor still thought he could win this with force. Danielle's voice thundered before he could even raise the canister. "Don't!" The single word cut through the summer air with a force that startled even her. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. A verdict. The voice of someone who had carried both the scars of injustice and the strength to stand against it. O'Connor's hand hesitated, hovering inches from the weapon. His eyes darted across the sea of witnesses. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in unison. "Put it down! We're recording everything! Try it and you're done!" The chorus grew louder, swelling into something Danielle had never experienced before. It wasn't just her against him anymore. It was the entire block, the entire neighborhood, standing behind her. Each voice added weight, a tidal wave that threatened to drown the last remnants of O'Connor's authority. Danielle took one step forward, then another, her eyes locked on his. She held her badge high, her voice unwavering. "You lay a finger on me again, and it won't just be the end of your career. It'll be the end of your freedom. Do you understand me?" Her words landed with the precision of a hammer striking steel. O'Connor's breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. For a moment, it looked as if he might defy her anyway, that he might cross the line fully into violence. Consequences be damned. His fingers twitched against the canister. And then, sirens. The distant wail of police cars sliced through the tension, growing louder by the second. Heads turned. The crowd shifted, and O'Connor's face went pale. Reinforcements. But not for him. Not this time. Two patrol cars screeched to a halt at the end of the street, lights spinning, sirens cutting off abruptly. Doors flew open. Out stepped two officers in crisp uniforms, but their body language was different. No aggression, no raised voices. They scanned the scene, their eyes landing on Danielle, on her badge still gleaming in the sun, on the dozens of phones pointed like evidence straight at O'Connor. And then, from the second car, a taller man emerged. His uniform was different, decorated, marked with rank. His presence alone silenced the crowd. Chief Raymond Carter, Danielle's father. The world seemed to tilt. Danielle's throat tightened. She hadn't called him directly, but of course the report she'd threatened had traveled fast. And now here he was, towering over the street, his expression unreadable, but his presence radiating authority so absolute it made O'Connor shrink where he stood. Chief Carter's voice cut through the charged silence like a blade. "O'Connor, step away from her." The command carried no room for argument. O'Connor stammered, his words tumbling uselessly from his lips. "Chief, I was responding to a theft report. Carter's hand shot up, silencing him. His eyes, dark and steady, flicked to the crowd, to the cameras, to his daughter standing proud and unflinching. He already knew the truth. He had seen enough. Danielle swallowed hard, emotions warring inside her. Relief, vindication, a sudden flood of memories of her father's warnings about moments just like this. But now, standing under his gaze, she felt something deeper. The power of legacy, of resilience passed from one generation to the next. The chief stepped closer to O'Connor, his voice low but sharp enough to cut bone. "You assaulted a citizen. You racially profiled her. You escalated without cause. And worst of all, you did it in front of the entire community. Do you understand what you've done?" O'Connor's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. Carter didn't wait. "Badge, now." The command rang out like a death sentence. The crowd erupted, cheers mixing with gasps of disbelief. O'Connor stood frozen, his face drained of all color. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unclipped his badge, the same piece of metal he had used to wield unchecked authority, and handed it over. Chief Carter took it without ceremony, without hesitation, and turned to the watching eyes of the community. "Justice will be served," he said simply. The roar that followed was deafening. Danielle felt her knees weaken, but she didn't falter. She stood tall, her heart swelling as tears burned the corners of her eyes. This was the climax, the moment every warning, every fear, every fight she had carried had led to. The abuse had been stopped, the abuser stripped of power, the truth undeniable. And yet, even as the noise surged around her, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because justice in one street didn't erase injustice everywhere else. And the impact of this moment, of a crowd that stood together, of a woman who refused to be silent, of a chief who chose truth over loyalty, would ripple far beyond this single afternoon. The roar of the crowd still echoed through the block long after O'Connor's trembling hands released his badge into Chief Carter's palm. The moment was like a tide breaking. People clapped. Some wept openly. Others simply stared in awe at what they had witnessed. Phones lowered, but not before every angle, every second, had been immortalized in digital memory, ready to ripple out into the wider world. Danielle stood at the center of it all, her chest rising and falling with the uneven rhythm of adrenaline's aftermath. She felt both invincible and unbearably vulnerable. The sting in her eyes wasn't just from the lingering burn of pepper spray. It was from the tears she had held back, the rage she had swallowed, the strength she had been forced to summon. And now, as the wave of sound washed over her, she realized the enormity of what had just happened. Her father turned toward her. Chief Carter, whose face had rarely cracked in public, whose reputation carried the weight of decades of service, looked at his daughter with an expression that blended fury at the injustice she'd endured with pride so deep it seemed to soften even his hardened edges. He didn't hug her, not here, not in front of all these eyes, but he placed a steady hand on her shoulder, and that alone carried the weight of an embrace. "You stood your ground," he said quietly, just for her. "You didn't let him break you." Danielle swallowed hard, her voice shaking but resolute. "I couldn't let him get away with it. Not again, not to me, not to anyone." The chief's jaw tightened. He gave a small nod. "And you won't. Not after today." O'Connor, now standing off to the side in shame, looked like a ghost of the man who had swaggered up minutes before, his weapon of authority dangling at his belt like a threat. Stripped of power, he seemed suddenly small. And for the first time, he realized what Danielle and every black citizen who had faced men like him had always known. Power without justice collapses under the weight of truth. The community surged closer, people shouting their support at Danielle, some even chanting her name. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, she's like a hero." His words carried, reaching Danielle's ears, and for the first time that day, she let herself smile, faint and fragile, but real. But even amid the victory, Danielle's mind churned. One bad cop had been exposed, yes, but how many more were out there, wearing the same badge, carrying the same arrogance, hiding behind the same uniform? How many voices hadn't been heard? How many victims had been silenced because there hadn't been a crowd, because there hadn't been cameras, because justice hadn't arrived in time? Her father stepped forward, addressing the gathered crowd. "Let this be a reminder," Chief Carter said, his voice carrying across the street with the weight of a vow. "No one, no officer, no man in uniform is above the law. We serve you. We protect you. And when one of us betrays that duty, they betray the very meaning of justice." Applause erupted, some people raising fists, others raising phones to stream his words live. It wasn't just a speech, it was a promise. One Danielle silently prayed he would keep. As the sun dipped lower, painting the city in shades of orange and gold, Danielle felt the day's gravity settle inside her. She knew her life had changed forever. By tomorrow, the footage would be everywhere, shared across timelines, dissected in headlines, replayed in countless homes. People would see her not just as a victim, but as a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of courage under fire. Yet she also knew symbols came with weight. Her story would inspire, yes, but it would also provoke. There would be backlash, doubt, anger. But Danielle was ready, because silence had never protected anyone. And after today, her voice carried not just her own strength, but the strength of everyone who had stood behind her, everyone who had ever whispered, "Enough." Walking back toward her father's car, Danielle turned once more to the street where it all had unfolded. The chalk outlines of that confrontation would fade, but its memory would not. It would live in the community's heartbeat, in the children who watched her stand tall, in the justice that had been wrestled out of the grip of abuse. She thought of her younger cousins, her neighbors, the kids who walked past squads of police every day with fear stitched into their steps. Tonight, maybe they'd walk a little taller. Maybe they'd believe that injustice, no matter how heavy, could be broken. As she slid into the back seat, her father pausing to exchange final words with the other officers, Danielle closed her eyes. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit burned with clarity. She whispered to herself, not as comfort, but as conviction. This is just the beginning. And as the car pulled away, the sounds of the chanting crowd still rising behind her, the screen would fade to black, with a final thought lingering for the audience. How many more Danacels are out there, waiting for justice to arrive? And how many of us will stand with them when the moment comes? The murmurs grew louder, people shouting now, not just in outrage, but in recognition. "She's the chief's daughter," one voice yelled. Phones zoomed in on the badge, on the officer's pale, trembling face. The power dynamic flipped in an instant. Maya forced herself upright, her eyes red and swollen, but blazing with fury. "You just assaulted the daughter of your commanding officer," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "And the entire city is watching." The officer stammered, backing away, his hand shaking as he holstered his pepper spray. His partner looked as if he might collapse. The crowd was relentless now, shouting, recording, demanding accountability. Within minutes, more squad cars arrived, but not to arrest Maya. They were there to pull the disgraced officer aside, to hold him accountable under the scrutiny of dozens of recording phones and one very powerful truth. The climax hit like a thunderclap. The man who had moments earlier stood above her with unchecked power was now cowering under the weight of his own actions, exposed and undone. And Maya, battered but unbroken, stood taller than she ever had, her voice steady as she declared to the crowd, "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. But not today. Not anymore." The aftermath was swift. The video went viral within hours. News outlets scrambling to report on the officer who pepper-sprayed the police chief's daughter. His suspension was immediate, his career likely destroyed. But for Maya, the victory was bittersweet. She lay in bed that night, eyes still sore, replaying the humiliation in her mind. She thought of the times her father had warned her that the badge on his chest couldn't always protect her from the world's ugliness. And yet, in the end, it had. not because of what it was, but because she had the courage to raise it in the face of abuse. In the weeks that followed, Maya didn't retreat. She stood taller, speaking at forums, demanding reforms, her voice amplified not because of her father's title, but because of her own unshakable resolve. "How many people," she asked crowds, her voice echoing with righteous anger, "never get the chance to hold up a badge, a title, a connection that forces people to see them as human? How many more names will we whisper before change finally comes?" The image of Maya, red-eyed but unbowed, holding up that badge against the blinding sun, lived on far longer than the incident itself. It wasn't just about her bike. It wasn't even just about her. It was about the thousands who never got to raise their voice before it was silenced. And that's why her story resonated. Because it wasn't only hers. And so, when people watched the video, when they shared it, when they commented with their own stories of injustice, Maya's pain transformed into something larger. A movement. A reminder that even when the system falters, individuals can still stand, resist, and demand to be seen. Ask yourself, Maya's final words echoed in one televised interview, her gaze unwavering. When the moment comes, will you record? Will you speak? Will you stand? The world had watched her stand. Now the question hung heavy in the air. Who would be next?